Welcome back to Understanding Human Anatomy in our discussion of the mediastinum. This is part 2. And we're starting with the diagram that was on the screen when we signed off the last time. I want to start by discussing the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct is the largest lymphatic vessel in the body, and it is carrying lymph from everywhere in the body below the level of the diaphragm. And in its course, it will receive the lymph from the thorax and head and neck on the left side of the body. So it roughly 3/4 of the lymph is going to be flowing through the thoracic duct. And of course, lymph is tissue fluid that is being brought back to the vascular system. So the thoracic duct eventually is going to end up emptying into a vein. Now, remember that the diaphragm is a dome, and the areas below the line here that I'm drawing on the posterior wall are on the posterior wall but behind the diaphragm. The diaphragm's domed posteriorly as well. But we'll start here. And the thoracic duct runs up along the right edge of the vertebral bodies until it gets to the level of T4, when it crosses over to the left side and comes up into the neck. Now, the thoracic duct will empty into the left subclavian vein. And since we haven't drawn the veins in yet, I can't draw the end of the thoracic duct. So we'll put that in as we get more of this diagram put together. I'm trying to work from the posterior and move forward. And we'll have now a label going to the thoracic duct. Recall when I talked about the intercostal space, I mentioned that there was an intercostal nerve, an intercostal artery, and an intercostal vein. That intercostal vein has to drain into a larger vein before returning to the heart. And we're going to find that there are a couple of different veins depending on which side of the body we're on. If we look at the right side of the body, there is a vein running on the posterior wall called the azygos vein. And I'm going to draw it looping to the right and then back around to the left. That's not actually what happens. It loops from posterior to anterior. And this is the azygos vein. And the azygos vein drains the intercostal veins on the right side of the body. It receives the intercostal veins on the right side of the body below the level of the sternal angle. Above the level of sternal angle, we'll have another vein. getting involved. So that's the right side. The left side gets a little bit more complicated because there are two veins. And they are Hemi azygos veins. And we have one starting inferiorly and running up like so. And then it crosses the midline to empty into the azygos. This is the Hemi azygos vein. And then we have one coming from superiorly down the left side, and it also crosses to drain into the azygos. This is the accessory hemiazygos. So let me put some labels on here. And the accessory hemiazygos vein here. So the hemiazygos vein receives intercostal veins on the right side from the subcostal vein, which would be the 12th of the trunk veins of the thorax, all the way up to around the 7th intercostal vein. The accessory hemiazygos receives the intercostal veins from T4 down to about T6 or T7. And both the accessory hemiazygos and the hemiazygos veins cross the midline to drain into the azygos vein. Sometimes the hemiazygos and the accessory hemiazygos meet end to end, and there's only one vessel crossing the midline. The azygos vein then drains into the superior vena cava after arching from the posterior to the anterior, and it enters the superior vena cava at about the level of T4. Next, we have the esophagus. The esophagus is the muscular tube that conveys food we've eaten from our oral cavity down to the stomach. And it is a midline structure that is slightly to the left of midline, comes down, gets a little bit to the right, and it reaches its furthest extent moving to the right at the sternal angle. Then it keeps moving left as it comes down, and it will come down in the posterior mediastinum and pass through the diaphragm at the level of T10. So And remember that the esophagus exits thorax through the diaphragm at the level of T10. And we'll draw a line over to the esophagus up here. So the esophagus exits at T10, goes through the diaphragm at the level of T10. Just anterior to the esophagus is the trachea. Now, trachea begins at the base of the larynx in the neck, and it enters through the thoracic inlet and comes down in the superior mediastinum until it gets to the level of T4, at which time it branches into two: a right main stem bronchus and a left main stem bronchus. And that branching into right and left main stem bronchi is at the level of T4, at the level of the sternal angle. So let me put some labels here. Have the trachea in green, and we'll draw a line over to the structure. And recall from an earlier lecture, I mentioned that the trachea has hyaline cartilaginous C-shaped rings, and I'll just indicate those rings like so. And then the bronchi have plates of hyaline cartilage in their wall. So we'll draw some plates in here. But they're not rings, they're just plates of cartilage in the bronchi. So we have the trachea and the right and left main stem, or right and left primary bronchi. So let's recap so far. You can see why I drew in the sternal angle level. The trachea bifurcates at the level of the sternal angle. The esophagus reaches its rightmost position at the level of the sternal angle and then starts angling over to the left. The azygos vein drains into the superior vena cava at the level of the sternal angle, at level of T4. And the thoracic duct crosses from the right side of the body to the left side of the body at the level of the sternal angle. I want to end this video at this point, and we'll pick up our diagram in the next video. Thank you for your attention.